Today, we become legends.
Yemoja is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting cases of Smite god design in the game. She's pretty much always overtuned in an objective sense, yet pretty much no one plays her. Let's talk about why. So first off, let's take a look at pick rates. Yemoja is and always has been one of the lowest pick rate gods in the game when you look at the whole of casuals and ranked. As with my previous videos like this one, I'll only be looking at Smite 1 data here because we don't have readily available large datasets for Smite 2 at the moment due to lack of API access. But usually the story is pretty similar in Smite 2 as well. Currently in Smite 1, Yemoja sits at 115th out of 130 in terms of pick rate for casual conquest. In ranked it's even worse as she sits at 124th out of 130. This general trend is true all the way up to Masters rank where she still remains one of the bottom picked gods in the game. Only at Grand Masters do we see Yemoja's pick rate rise a little bit to 103 out of 130. And none of this is due to a high ban rate either. Yemoja's ban rate is very low across all ranks in Smite 1 right now. There is one thing to consider when looking at Smite 1 data here though, and that is the fact that the game has been replaced for the most part by Smite 2, and the most hardcore players who are generally the most skilled have moved over to Smite 2. The current player base of Smite 1 is likely noticeably more casual than it was during its heyday, and to get to the meat of the video a bit early on here, Yemoja is not a casual friendly god. Difficulty is very subjective and a multifaceted topic when it comes to Smite gods, but if Yemoja is not at least in your conversation for the hardest god to pilot in the game, then you're doing something wrong. In my personal opinion, she is the hardest god to play optimally in the entire game. Sure, you could argue that Morrigan players need to know every character in the game to play optimally, but in reality that's not really the case, and her base kit isn't very hard to pilot. Sure, you can make the case that Ula might be the most mechanically difficult god to execute on perfectly, but that's just one part of what makes a god difficult to play in my view. Yemoja pretty much strikes every facet of what makes a god difficult, which is why I think she's the overall hardest god in the game to get into. Though I will say Aladdin has given her a run for her money that he was literally reworked recently to make him easier to play because he was an actual liability to have on your team outside of high rank play. So what makes Yemoja so difficult? Well, at the core of it is her Omi passive and how it works. For those unaware, Yemoja does not use mana and her abilities do not have cooldowns. She instead generates Omi charges over time which can be used to cast her abilities. As long as you have the Omi, you can cast as many abilities in whatever order as you want and they have no cooldown. But if you have no Omi, you can't cast any of your basic abilities until you get some back. Her ultimate does have a regular cooldown though. This system is so fundamentally different in the way it plays from every other god that I think it breaks people's brains a little bit, especially the more casual players who are already prone to the "it's up so I might as well cast it" trope. Just because an ability is available, that doesn't mean it's the right time to use it, and this is a fundamental skill that all Smite players must learn if they want to improve. Wasting your abilities and getting caught with nothing available is how you die a very sad death, and Yemoja takes this concept to the extreme because technically her base abilities are always available, providing you have the Omi. This I think leads to less experienced players spamming her buttons for low value in the wrong situation and being caught with nothing available much more often than they would on a traditional character. Anyone who's played Yemoja knows how useless you feel when you have no Omi available, and if you waste it all, you'll be in that useless state for longer than normal mana and cooldown based characters. Another aspect of Omi that makes Yemoja difficult is the concept of opportunity cost. If you're presented with a free car or a free all expenses paid vacation and you take the car, the vacation is your opportunity cost. It's the thing you missed out on because you decided to take the other option. No other god in the game has opportunity cost built into their design the same way Yemoja does. Sure, in specific situations like when you're very low on mana, you might choose to not cast your one so you can cast your ultimate instead, but with Yemoja, every single ability you cast has an opportunity cost associated with it because they all use the same fundamental resource. Do you want to use your 3 to get your allies into the fight, or do you want to save Omi so you have enough for your 1 to stun the enemies afterwards? Do you want to heal your allies with your 2 or save the Omi to bounce them out of a bad spot with your 3? This concept of opportunity cost introduces an entire element of gameplay to Yemoja that no other god has to anywhere near this degree. Low mana situations aside, casting Herc's 2-1 combo doesn't impact your ability to cast his 3 later on. Playing Yemoja is almost like playing any other god, but casting one of their basic abilities also puts the other ones on cooldown. Instead of doing a Ymir wall into freeze into 2, you have to decide whether to wall, to freeze, or to 2. Of course, that's not exactly how Yemoja works, but I think it's a good way to explain the concept and how it impacts her difficulty, especially in the hands of less experienced players. As I mentioned earlier, the less experienced you are with Smite, the more likely you are to just cast your abilities as soon as they come off cooldown without thinking about the longer term implications of doing so. But do that on Yemoja and you're in for a very bad time, much worse than any other god in the game, which is a large part of why she performs so poorly in the hands of casual or less experienced players, but performs incredibly well in the hands of pros. The pros know when to spam and when to hold back, and know the relative value of each of her 1, 2, and 3 in any situation, and won't waste their Omi on casting 3 Riptides to chase down the enemy team, only to have nothing to follow up with and die for it. Obviously, I'm talking about difficulty here and not popularity, but they are highly correlated. If you've seen my Why Everyone Plays Neath and Nuwa videos, this is explained in a bit more detail there, but the general idea is pretty obvious. If a god can be piloted to a decent level with minimal investment, it means more players can play the god, and thus they are more popular, because, and I know this is crazy, people like winning in a competitive video game, and if they get completely face rolled every time they pick a character, they're probably going to stop picking that character. Of course, some players like a challenge and will persevere until they learn, but I'm talking in a general sense here about the player base as a whole. So anytime I mention difficulty, I'm also saying the god isn't popular because of that difficulty, and that's backed up by data. There's a reason most of the most popular characters in the game are very easy to play. But that's just her Omi, and while that's by far the biggest factor in her difficulty, Yemoja isn't super easy on a mechanical level either. Sure, she's no Ula, but on the grand scale of Smite God, she's one of the more mechanically difficult ones to pilot. Her 1 in both forms has a very unique targeter that takes some getting used to, and especially the stun on Moonstrike, which is critical to playing her well, can be difficult to land at range sometimes due to the delay. Even something that might seem simple to us more experienced players, like bouncing an enemy back with the reverse Riptide, is probably more difficult to land than anything in the kits of half of Smite's gods. Even her ultimate is more tricky to get the most out of compared to 90% of other ults in the game. Sure, you'll always get the Omi regen to spam some more abilities and the 2 walls, but maximizing this ability demands a bit more from the player, such as using terrain walls and or Riptides to create a true cage that can't be escaped from. That requires a lot of map knowledge and or on-the-fly awareness to spot out a position where you can get a true cage, and anyone who's played against a good Yemoja will know that consistently hitting these makes her ultimate significantly more devastating. Even something as simple as proper placement of the walls to separate a fight and isolate a key target can be tough to get down for less experienced players that don't have years of game sense baked into their brains. Oh, and on top of all that, this ult has the longest cooldown of any ability in the entire game, so going back to that earlier point of wasting abilities instead of waiting for the right moment, wasting this ult is much more impactful than wasting a standard 90-second cooldown ult, which leaves more room for breakage in the hands of a bad Yemoja player. Hell, even Yemoja's builds are pretty atypical and unintuitive compared to a lot of other support builds. Cooldown reduction directly increases her Omi regeneration rate, which probably a lot of you know, but a new player picking up the game for the first time and trying Yemoja, because yes, Yemoja is a free character in Smite 1, they aren't likely to know this unless they're a fan of reading an entire novel before they try out a god. Building for extremely high cooldown rate makes Yemoja far more effective than building for high protections or health, and that's not something a new or less experienced player will intuitively know, and the problems that the Omi system creates only get magnified when you aren't building for high cooldown. And even if they did read the novel before playing Yemoja, nowhere is it explained that flat cooldown refund effects like Chronos Pendant and Spear of Desolation will give you a burst of Omi when they proc. Sure, you can probably reason that this would be the case if you're a fairly experienced Smite player, but if you're not, this might not even cross your mind, yet these kind of items, especially Spear of Desolation, are often built by high-level Yemoja players in the support role, which is not at all what you would expect if all you've played so far is Ymir and Bacchus and you got flamed for building damage items and support. All of this culminates in one of, if not the most difficult god to pilot in the entire game, and despite being frequently overtuned as demonstrated by pro players, she still does very poorly in lower and mid levels of play where the majority of players are, and thus her pick rate is in the toilet because losing repeatedly isn't fun for most people. So yeah, that's why no one plays Yemoja. She's extremely unorthodox and extremely difficult to play, which leads to the majority of people not doing well on her and dropping the character in favor of something easier to get into. But what are your thoughts? Are you a Yemoja main and love her to death, or are you a Yemoja hater that doesn't like to get chain stunned at level 1? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.